On a quiet evening in the bustling heart of the city, Officer Mark Bellinger leaned against his squad car, his breath misting in the chilly air. The street lights flickered like faint stars, casting long shadows on the sidewalk. Mark had been on the force for years, earning a reputation as a man who didn't always play by the book. To some, he was a hero. To others, he was the kind of cop with bloodlines to get results. Tonight, he was about to make a decision that would alter the course of his life forever. Across the street, a young black man in a tailored suit emerged from a modest cafe, a leather briefcase swinging at his side. His movements were confident, yet unassuming, as if he carried the weight of the world but refused to let it show. Mark's eyes followed him, curiosity sparking like a live wire. It was something about the man's demeanor, calm, collected, but with a subtle edge, that piqued the officer's interest. "Hey, who's that?" Mark muttered to himself, narrowing his eyes. The man looked neither familiar nor out of place, yet Mark's instincts told him there was more to the story. He slid into his car, the engine purring to life, and tailed the man from a distance. It wasn't an official investigation. Mark had no reason to follow him. No call from dispatch, no tip-off from an informant. It was a gut feeling, the kind that had led him down murky paths before. The young man stopped at a crosswalk, waiting patiently for the light to change. His briefcase gleamed under the streetlight, and Mark's imagination began to churn. Asterisk, asterisk what was in their asterisk, asterisk papers? Money? Something illicit. The possibilities seemed endless, and each one felt more tantalizing than the last. When the man turned down a quieter street, Mark seized the moment. Parking his car at the curb, he stepped out, his boots echoing on the pavement. "Excuse me," he called out, his tone neutral but firm. The man turned slowly, his expression calm but wary. "Yes, officer. Can I help you?" Mark approached, the badge on his chest catching the light. "Mind telling me what you're doing out here so late?" The man raised an eyebrow, his grip tightening on the briefcase. "Just heading home. Is that a problem?" Mark's eyes flicked to the briefcase again. "What's in there?" The man hesitated, his jaw tightening. "Personal documents. Nothing that concerns you." That answer didn't sit well with Mark. He'd heard it all before. Excuses, deflections, lies. "Mind if I take a look?" "I do mind," the man replied evenly. "Unless you have a warrant, I believe I'm within my rights to refuse." Mark's jaw clenched. The man was right, of course, but that only fueled his determination. "Just routine, sir. It'll only take a minute." The man stepped back, his tone sharpening. "No, you're overstepping." But Mark was already reaching for the briefcase. A small struggle ensued, nothing physical, just a clash of wills. Finally, with a swift tug, Mark pried the briefcase from the man's hand. The young man protested, his voice rising in indignation, but Mark ignored him. He snapped open the latches, his heart pounding with anticipation. And then he saw it. The contents of the briefcase weren't what he'd expected. There were no drugs, no stacks of cash, no forged IDs. Instead, there were documents, dozens of them, bearing official seals and signatures. As Mark scanned the pages, his face drained of color. Each word he read felt like a hammer blow, each line more damning than the last. The young man stood silently, his eyes locked on Mark's as if daring him to piece it all together. Mark's hands trembled as he realized the gravity of what he'd uncovered. These weren't just any documents. They were evidence, proof of something so deeply incriminating, so career-ending, that Mark's mind raced to find a way out of the mess he'd just plunged himself into. "What? What is this?" Mark stammered, his voice barely a whisper. The young man's lips curved into a faint, knowing smile. "Exactly what it looks like." Mark's throat tightened. He'd crossed a line tonight, and now he was staring at the consequences, laid bare in the open briefcase. Whatever he thought he was about to uncover, this was far worse. And in that moment, standing under the flickering streetlight, Mark realized he wasn't the one holding the power anymore. The air between them grew heavy with unspoken tension. Mark glanced around, his mind racing for an escape, a way to undo the mistake he'd just made. But it was too late, the damage was done, and the young man wasn't backing down. Mark swallowed hard, knowing that his life would never be the same after this night. Mark's breath came shallow as he stared at the damning papers in his hands. The young man before him stood unwavering, his gaze sharp and calm, as though this moment was something he had prepared for. In the stillness of the empty street, the hum of distant traffic felt like a roar in Mark's ears. He hadn't anticipated this. A situation spiraling out of his control faster than he could think of a way to fix it. "Where did you get these?" Mark demanded, his voice rough, trying to regain some semblance of authority. He didn't look up. He couldn't tear his eyes from the pages. Each one seemed more incriminating than the last. Words jumped out at him. Internal memos, signed directives, confidential seals. Pieces of a puzzle that painted a grim picture. But the picture wasn't about the young man. It was about someone much closer to Mark's world. The young man folded his arms, his expression unreadable. "It doesn't matter where I got them. What matters is that you shouldn't have them in your hands. And you know that." Mark's stomach twisted. He could feel the sweat starting to bead on his forehead, despite the chill in the air. These documents, these career-ending, maybe even life-destroying documents, weren't supposed to exist, let alone be floating around in the hands of a stranger. Yet here they were, laid bare in his grasp, threatening to drag him into a web far more tangled than he'd bargained for. "How do I know these are real?" Mark asked, trying to steady his voice. "These could be fakes." "Check for yourself," the man replied simply. "But you and I both know they're real." Mark's chest tightened. The young man was right. Everything about these papers screamed authenticity. And if they were real, they were dangerous. Dangerous to someone like Mark, someone who had built a career walking a tightrope between right and wrong. The young man's eyes narrowed slightly, studying Mark's reaction. "You've seen enough. Now give it back." Mark looked up sharply. "Why are you carrying this around? What's your angle here?" The man smirked faintly, though his tone remained measured. "My angle? That's the funny part, officer. I didn't come looking for you. You're the one who couldn't resist crossing a line." That truth hit harder than Mark wanted to admit. He'd acted on impulse, and now it felt like he was caught in a trap of his own making. His instincts, the same ones that had often pulled him out of trouble, were failing him tonight. Every second stretched unbearably long, the weight of his decision pressing down on him. Mark's mind raced to piece things together. Who was this man? He didn't look like someone trying to stir trouble. His calm demeanor, his precise words, it all hinted at a purpose, a plan. But what kind of plan? And why would he carry such incriminating evidence around so casually, as though it were nothing more than a collection of old receipts? "What's your name?" Mark asked, his tone harsher than he intended. "Does it matter?" The young man shot back. "You're not writing a report, are you?" Mark gritted his teeth. This man was infuriatingly composed, as if he knew every move Mark would make before he made it. He couldn't afford to let his frustration show, though. Not now, when the stakes were so high. The young man took a step closer, his voice lowering. "If I were you, I'd think carefully about what happens next. Those documents, whatever you think you're going to do with them, they're bigger than you. Bigger than me, even." Mark stiffened at the ominous undertone in the man's words. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying you've stumbled into something you're not ready for. This isn't about chasing suspects or bending a few rules to get ahead. This is a storm, and if you're not careful, it'll swallow you whole." Mark didn't respond immediately. He could feel the truth of the man's words settling uncomfortably in his chest. He wanted to believe he had control over the situation, but the longer he stood there, the clearer it became that control was slipping through his fingers like sand. Finally he said, "You don't know who I am or what I can handle." The young man tilted his head slightly, his expression almost pitying. "Maybe I don't, but I do know this. You're not the first cop who thought he could get away with overstepping, and you won't be the last." There was no malice in his tone, no threat. But the weight of his words hit Mark like a punch to the gut. He hated the vulnerability they exposed, the undeniable truth that he was out of his depth. A car passed by in the distance, its headlights briefly illuminating their faces. Mark looked at the briefcase again, then at the man who stood firm before him. He didn't know how to fix this, how to untangle himself from the mess he created. But one thing was clear. This young man wasn't someone who would be easily intimidated or dismissed. Mark's grip tightened on the papers. He was at a crossroads. He could arrest the man, try to bury the evidence, pretend this night never happened. But deep down, he knew it wouldn't be that simple. Too many people would ask questions, and eventually the truth would find its way to the surface. Or he could do the unthinkable, turn away, leave the man and his briefcase alone, and walk back to his car as if nothing had happened. But that too felt impossible. His pride, his instincts, his very identity as an officer of the law rebelled against the idea of letting someone walk away with something so explosive. Before he could make a decision, the young man broke the silence. "You have a choice, officer. Keep digging and risk everything, or let this go and save yourself the trouble. Either way, you won't come out of this the same." Mark's jaw clenched. He hated choices like this. No clear right or wrong, just shades of grey that blurred the lines he'd spent his career walking. He felt trapped, as though the walls of the quiet street were closing in on him. The young man took another step closer, his voice dropping to almost a whisper. "You think you're holding the power right now, but you're not. You opened that briefcase, and now you're in it just as deep as I am." Mark swallowed hard, his mind spinning. He didn't know where this night was heading, but he could feel it pulling him towards something darker, something that would force him to confront truths he wasn't ready to face. As the young man reached out to take back his briefcase, Mark hesitated, his hand hovering over the damning documents. His pulse thundered in his ears, his thoughts a chaotic mess of fear, anger, and uncertainty. And then in the dim light of the street lamp, a single question burned in his mind, louder than all the rest. Who was this man, and what had he just walked into? Mark felt like his mind was spinning as he watched the young man take back the briefcase. His fingers had hesitated, hovering over the documents, but he hadn't been able to hold on to them. There was something about the way the man carried himself, that calm certainty, that made it feel like the briefcase belonged to him in ways Mark couldn't contest. Yet, the fear and anger still churned in Mark's chest. He'd seen too much now to simply walk away, but he had no idea how to move forward without making everything worse. The young man latched the briefcase shut with deliberate care, his gaze flicking briefly to Mark before he spoke again. "You should go home, officer. Whatever you think this is, it's not worth the price you're about to pay." Mark straightened, trying to reassert his authority. "I'm not going anywhere until I get some answers. Who are you? Why are you carrying those documents? You're not just some guy walking home from work." The man exhaled slowly, almost like he was disappointed. "You really think you're the one asking the questions here? Let me spell it out for you. You don't want to know what's in this briefcase or what it means. People who dig too deep usually regret it." Mark clenched his fists. "I've dealt with worse." The man's expression darkened slightly, though his tone stayed controlled. "You think so? You think you're ready for what comes next if you keep pushing? Because let me tell you something. You're not. This doesn't end with you writing a report and calling it a day. This ends with people at the top making sure no one ever hears about tonight, including you." Mark's stomach twisted again, but he refused to let the fear show on his face. "Is that a threat?" "No," the man said quietly. "It's a fact." For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The distant sound of a siren somewhere across the city broke the silence, a faint reminder of the world still spinning outside this tense standoff. Mark's mind raced, trying to piece together what little he knew. This man, this stranger, wasn't ordinary. He wasn't a criminal, at least not in the way Mark usually dealt with. He had poise, intelligence, and most disturbingly, leverage. That briefcase was proof of that. Finally, Mark broke the silence. "You're protecting someone, aren't you? Someone powerful. That's why you have those papers." The young man didn't respond immediately, but the faintest flicker of something, was it surprise, crossed his face. It was gone just as quickly, replaced by the same calm mask he'd worn since the beginning. "You're asking the wrong questions," the man finally said. "It's not about who I'm protecting. It's about who's willing to destroy everything to keep this buried." Mark frowned, his curiosity outweighing his better judgment. "So, what are you? Some kind of whistleblower?" The man's lips quirked in a bitter smile. "Something like that." Mark's pulse quickened. He'd stumbled across people like this before. Individuals tangled in things much larger than themselves, people trying to expose corruption or cover their own tracks. But this felt different, bigger, and more dangerous. Before Mark could press further, the man spoke again, his voice low but firm. "If you're smart, you'll pretend this never happened. Forget you saw me. Forget you saw the briefcase. Go back to your life while you still can." Mark narrowed his eyes. "You don't get to decide how this plays out." The man shook his head slightly, his gaze almost pitying. "No, but they do. And trust me, they won't play fair." Mark opened his mouth to respond, but a sudden movement down the street caught his eye. A black SUV rolled slowly into view, its headlights dimmed. It wasn't marked, but there was something about it, something deliberate and calculating, that sent a chill down Mark's spine. The young man noticed it too, his expression hardening in an instant. "They're here," he muttered under his breath. Mark tensed. "Who?" The man didn't answer. Instead, he stepped back, clutching the briefcase tightly. His demeanor shifted from calm to urgent, his movements quicker, more purposeful. "Listen to me," he said, his voice low but forceful. "You don't want to be here when they stop. Leave. Now." Mark's instincts screamed at him to ask more questions, to demand answers. But the SUV slowed to a crawl, its windows tinted so dark Mark couldn't see who was inside. The air seemed to thicken with tension, every second dragging painfully. The young man glanced at Mark one last time. "Walk away, officer. This is your last chance." Mark hesitated, his heart pounded in his chest as he weighed his options. He didn't trust this man, didn't like how much he didn't know. But the SUV's presence changed everything. Whoever was inside wasn't here for a friendly chat. The vehicle stopped a few yards away, its engine idling quietly. Mark's hand instinctively moved to his holster, but the young man shook his head sharply. "Don't. They'll see it as a threat, and that's another fight you want." Mark cursed under his breath. He hated feeling out of control, hated being caught in the middle of something he didn't understand. But for the first time that night, he considered doing what the man had been telling him all along, leaving. The SUV's passenger door opened, and a man in a sleek black suit stepped out. He moved with precision, his eyes scanning the street before landing on the young man. He didn't look at Mark, didn't even acknowledge his presence. Instead, his focus was singular, his expression cold and unreadable. "Mr. Roberts," the suited man said, his tone clipped and formal. "You've made things unnecessarily difficult." The young man, Roberts, apparently didn't flinch. "I told you I'm not handing it over." The man in the suit sighed, as though he were dealing with a stubborn child. "You don't have a choice." Mark's grip tightened on his holster, every muscle in his body screaming at him to do something. But he couldn't move. He didn't know what was happening, didn't know who this man was or what he wanted. All he knew was that the tension was about to snap, and when it did, everything would change. The man in the suit took a step closer, his eyes narrowing. "Hand over the briefcase, Mr. Roberts. This is your final warning." Roberts didn't move. His grip on the briefcase tightened, his jaw set. Not happening. For a moment, everything was still. Then, without warning, the man in the suit gestured toward the SUV, and two more men stepped out, their movements brisk and deliberate. Mark's pulse skyrocketed as they approached, their intentions unmistakable. This was it, the moment where everything would come to a head. Mark's breathing quickened as the two men from the SUV approached. They were tall, broad-shouldered, and moved with the kind of confidence that came from knowing they would be challenged. Their dark suits blended into the night, but their intent was crystal clear. Mark's hand hovered over his holster, his instincts screaming at him to intervene, yet he was frozen, caught between fear and uncertainty. Roberts stood his ground, the briefcase clutched tightly in his hands. His calm facade was beginning to crack. Mark could see the tension in his shoulders, the flicker of unease in his eyes. Still, he didn't back down. Instead, he turned slightly, positioning himself so the briefcase was shielded from the men. It was a subtle move, but it spoke volumes. The man in the suit, the one who had first addressed Roberts, remained by the SUV. He didn't move closer, but his presence was heavy, commanding. He watched the scene unfold with a cold, calculating gaze, as though he were already 10 steps ahead. "Mr. Roberts," he said again, his tone sharper now. "This is a waste of everyone's time. You know how this ends." Roberts didn't reply. His jaw tightened, and his grip on the briefcase didn't falter. The two men from the SUV stopped a few feet away, their stances rigid and intimidating. One of them spoke, his voice low and firm. "Hand it over, or we'll take it." Mark's fingers twitched near his holster. He wasn't sure what these men wanted, but their presence and the tension in the air told him it wasn't anything good. His gut told him this was about more than just the documents. It was about control, power, and secrets too dangerous to see the light of day. "I don't think you understand," Roberts said, his voice steady despite the odds stacked against him. "You can't take this from me. Not without consequences." The man in the suit laughed softly, a sound that sent a chill down Mark's spine. "Consequences? Is that supposed to scare me? You've already overplayed your hand, Mr. Roberts. You've got nowhere to go." Roberts glanced at Mark for the briefest of moments. It wasn't a plea for help. It was something else, a silent acknowledgement of the impossible situation they were both in. Then he turned back to the suited man. "I've got more leverage than you think," Roberts said, his voice like steel. "If something happens to me, these documents will still get out. You can't stop it." Mark's eyes widened. He wasn't sure if Roberts was bluffing or telling the truth, but the weight of his words hung heavy in the air. The man in the suit didn't seem fazed, though. If anything, his expression hardened, his patience wearing thin. "That's a dangerous gamble," the man said. "And you're not in a position to gamble." Mark's mind raced. He didn't know who these men were or why they wanted the briefcase so badly, but it was clear this was about more than just protecting a secret. This was about silencing someone who knew too much, and Mark was starting to realize he might have stumbled into something he couldn't walk away from. One of the men from the SUV stepped forward, reaching for the briefcase. Roberts took a quick step back, his movements sharp and deliberate. "Don't," he warned. "I'm serious." The man paused, his hand hovering midair. For a moment, it seemed like he might listen. But then he lunged forward, faster than Mark expected, his hand closing around the handle of the briefcase. Roberts reacted instantly, pulling back with all his strength. The briefcase jerked between them, the metal latches straining under the pressure. Mark took a step forward, his instincts finally overriding his hesitation. "Stop!" he barked, his voice cutting through the chaos. "Everyone, back off." The two men from the SUV glanced at him, their expressions unreadable. For a split second, Mark thought they might actually listen. But then the man holding the briefcase yanked harder, and the sound of tearing fabric filled the air as Roberts lost his grip and stumbled back. The briefcase was ripped open in the struggle, its contents spilling onto the pavement. Papers fluttered like fallen leaves, their official seals and bold signatures catching the dim light. For a moment, everyone froze, their eyes locked on the documents scattered at their feet. Mark's heart sank. He could see the words clearly now. Names, dates, transactions. It was worse than he'd imagined. These weren't just Downing papers. They were a roadmap to corruption, a trail that led straight to people with the power to destroy lives. The suited man's composure cracked for the first time. His eyes narrowed, and his lips pressed into a thin line. "Pick it up," he barked to his men. Roberts moved quickly, diving toward the papers, but one of the men shoved him aside, hard enough to send him sprawling. Mark reacted without thinking, stepping forward and grabbing the man's arm. "Hey," he snapped. "Back off." The man turned to Mark, his expression cold and dangerous. "Stay out of this, officer. You don't know what we're dealing with." Mark didn't let go. "Try me." The tension between them was electric, the air heavy with the threat of violence. The suited man took a step closer, his tone sharp and commanding. "Enough. We don't have time for this." Roberts struggled to his feet, his eyes darting between the scattered papers and the men who were now gathering them up. Mark could see the desperation in his expression, the realization that he was losing control of the situation. "You can't let them take it," Roberts said, his voice directed at Mark now. "If they get those papers, it's over. For everyone." Mark hesitated. He wanted to believe Roberts, but every instinct he had told him this wasn't his fight. And yet, he couldn't shake the feeling that walking away would make him complicit in something far worse than he could imagine. The men from the SUV moved quickly, gathering the papers and shoving them back into the briefcase. Roberts tried to lunge for them again, but the suited man stepped in, blocking his path. "You've lost," the man said coldly. "Walk away while you still can." But Roberts didn't back down. His gaze shifted to Mark, a silent plea in his eyes. "You have a choice," he said, his voice low but urgent. "Do the right thing, or let them bury the truth." Mark's pulse thundered in his ears. He was standing on the edge of a decision that would change everything, and he knew there was no turning back. Mark stood frozen, every nerve in his body screaming at him to make a choice. Robert's words hung heavy in the air, a challenge he couldn't ignore. But before he could act, a new sound cut through the tense standoff, a sharp, piercing whistle from the far end of the street. Everyone's heads turned in unison, their attention drawn to the shadows just beyond the dim reach of the streetlights. A figure emerged, walking slowly but deliberately toward the scene. The person was tall, clad in a dark hoodie that obscured their face, but their presence was undeniable. They moved with an air of quiet confidence, their steps echoing faintly against the pavement. For a moment, no one spoke or moved, the sheer unexpectedness of the intrusion throwing everyone off balance. The suited man's eyes narrowed as he turned to face the newcomer. "Who the hell are you?" he demanded, his voice sharp with irritation. The figure didn't answer immediately. They stopped a few feet away, their face still hidden in shadow, and turned their heads slightly toward Roberts. "You're cutting it close, aren't you?" The voice was calm, steady, and oddly familiar. Roberts straightened, his expression a mix of surprise and relief. "I didn't think you'd show up." The suited man's irritation turned to suspicion. He signaled to his men, who shifted their positions, readying themselves for whatever this was. Mark's grip on his holster tightened, his gaze flicking between the newcomer and the group from the SUV. The tension was mounting again, sharper now, more dangerous. The hooded figure stepped forward, just enough for the dim light to catch their face. Mark's breath hitched. It was a woman, her sharp features illuminated briefly before she pulled the hood back farther. Her eyes were piercing, focused, and she carried an unshakable confidence that matched Robert's. "I'm here to make sure you don't screw this up," she said, directing her words at Roberts before shifting her gaze to the suited man. "And to clean up the mess you people keep leaving behind." The suited man's jaw tightened. "I don't know who you think you are, but this doesn't concern you." The woman tilted her head slightly, a faint smile tugging at her lips. "Doesn't it? You're about to make a mistake you can't take back, and I'm here to make sure that doesn't happen." Mark's mind raced, trying to piece together who she was and how she fit into this tangled web. Her presence seemed to shift the power dynamic, though he couldn't tell in whose favor. Roberts, however, seemed emboldened by her arrival, his stance less defensive, more assured. "You have no idea what you're dealing with," the suited man said, his tone darkening. "Walk away while you still can." The woman raised an eyebrow. Funny. I was about to say the same thing to you. One of the men from the SUV stepped forward, his patience clearly running out. We're done here, he growled, moving toward Roberts again. But before he could take another step, the woman reached into her pocket and pulled out a small device, a phone, or maybe something more advanced. She held it up, her finger hovering over the screen. Touch him. And I press this button, she said, her voice calm but laced with authority. And I guarantee you won't like what happens next. The suited man's eyes narrowed, his gaze locked on the device. What is that? A failsafe, the woman replied. Let's just say it's connected to certain files. Files that will go live the second I hit send. Mark's stomach dropped. Another layer to the mystery, another twist he hadn't seen coming. If she was telling the truth, then this wasn't just about the papers in the briefcase. There was a whole network of information, a backup plan designed to ensure nothing stayed hidden. The suited man's expression darkened further. You're bluffing. The woman smiled faintly. Try me. The tension in the air was suffocating now, every second stretching unbearably. The men from the SUV exchanged uncertain glances, clearly waiting for a signal from their leader. The suited man hesitated, his confidence wavering for the first time. Mark could see the calculation in his eyes, the internal debate about whether this was a risk worth taking. Fine, the suited man finally said, his tone clipped. You've made your point, but don't think this is over. The woman didn't respond, her gaze steady as the suited man signaled to his men. They stepped back reluctantly, their movements slow and deliberate. Mark's pulse was still racing, his hand hovering near his holster as he watched them retreat to the SUV. Before getting into the vehicle, the suited man cast one last look at Roberts and the woman. You've bought yourself some time, he said coldly, but it won't last. With that, he climbed into the SUV, and the engine roared to life. The vehicle pulled away, disappearing into the darkness as quickly as it had appeared. The street fell silent again, the tension lingering like an aftershock. Roberts let out a long breath, his shoulders sagging slightly. That was too close, he muttered, glancing at the woman. What took you so long? She shrugged, slipping the device back into her pocket. Traffic. Mark stared at them, his mind spinning. Someone needs to start explaining, he said, his voice sharp. Who are you? And what the hell is going on? The woman turned to him, her gaze assessing. You've seen too much to walk away now, haven't you? Mark didn't answer. He couldn't. He was too far in to back out. But he still didn't have the answers he needed. And as much as he hated to admit it, he wasn't sure he'd survive this if he didn't start getting them soon. Mark's jaw tightened as the woman stared him down, her expression unreadable but charged with an energy that demanded answers. Roberts, still clutching the battered briefcase, stepped between them, holding up a hand as if to keep the peace. Look, officer, Roberts said, his voice calm but wary. I get it. You want to know what's going on, but the less you know, the safer you are. Mark's patience snapped. Safe? Do it look safe to you? I've been dragged into whatever mess this is, and now I've got people threatening me just for being here. Start talking more I'll. You'll do what? The woman interrupted, her tone cool and measured. Call for backup. Report us. Trust me, officer, this goes deeper than you can imagine. You think anyone in your department could handle this? They're probably part of it. Mark felt the floor drop out from under him. He'd suspected corruption before. There were always whispers, things swept under the rug. But hearing it said so plainly hit like a punch to the gut. You're saying this goes all the way up? The woman tilted her head slightly, her eyes narrowing. Not just your department. This thing, it's bigger than one city, one precinct. The people you just saw, they're small players in a very large game. Mark clenched his fists, frustration bubbling over. Then why involve me? Why not go to someone who can actually do something about it? Roberts finally spoke again, his voice quieter now. Because you weren't supposed to be involved, officer. None of this was supposed to happen here. But now that it has, you've got a choice to make. Mark stared at him, his mind racing. He thought back to the initial encounter, the briefcase, the tension, the documents spilling out onto the pavement. The pieces were starting to fit together, but the picture they formed was one he didn't want to see. Those documents, Mark said slowly, pointing at the briefcase. They're proof, aren't they? Proof of everything you're saying. Roberts nodded. Names, transactions, entire networks. It's all in here. Enough to bring them down, if it gets into the right hands. And if it doesn't? Mark asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The woman answered this time, her tone grim. Then the people in that SUV will hunt down anyone who's seen it. That includes you, officer. The weight of her words settled over Mark like a heavy blanket. He'd been trained to handle danger, to face threats head-on. But this was something else entirely. This wasn't just about his life. It was about a system so corrupt it made everything he stood for feel like a lie. Before he could respond, the sound of tires screeching in the distance snapped everyone to attention. The woman cursed under her breath, her hand moving instinctively toward her pocket. They're coming back. Roberts turned to Mark, his expression urgent. We don't have time to argue. Are you with us or not? Mark hesitated for only a second before nodding. What's the plan? The woman smiled faintly, a hint of approval in her eyes. Good. We stick to the fallback. What fallback? Mark asked, but she was already moving, motioning for Roberts to follow. Mark grabbed his radio instinctively, his training kicking in, but he didn't call for backup. He wasn't sure who he could trust anymore. They moved quickly, ducking into an alley as headlights swept over the street. The roar of engines grew louder, and Mark risked a glance back. 2 SUVs now, their blacked-out windows gleaming under the streetlights. The same men, plus reinforcements. Keep moving, the woman hissed, her voice sharp but quiet. They darted through a maze of alleys, the sounds of pursuit growing louder behind them. Roberts clutched the briefcase like a lifeline, his breathing ragged but determined. Mark stayed close, his hand never leaving his holster. Finally, they burst out onto a deserted industrial lot, the open space, a stark contrast to the cramped alleys. The woman stopped abruptly, pulling out her device again. She tapped rapidly on the screen, her expression focused. What are you doing? Mark asked, his heart pounding. Calling in insurance, she said without looking up. We're not getting out of this alone. Before Mark could ask what she meant, the SUVs screeched into the lot, their headlights flooding the area with blinding light. The men spilled out, weapons drawn, their expressions cold and unrelenting. The suited man stepped forward, his face a mask of controlled fury. You should have stayed out of this, he said, his voice low but seething. Now it's too late. The woman straightened, slipping her device back into her pocket. Funny, I was about to say the same thing to you. A low hum filled the air, faint at first, but growing steadily louder. Mark turned, squinting into the darkness, and his breath caught. A drone, a large one, military-grade, descended from the sky, its lights casting an eerie glow over the lot. It hovered just above the ground, its presence both intimidating and surreal. The suited man's composure faltered for the first time. What is this? Insurance, the woman said simply. The drone emitted a series of beeps, and a voice crackled to life through its speakers. Stand down, or we release everything. The suited man's eyes widened, his confidence finally shattering. He turned to his men, shouting orders, but the drone moved closer, its cameras zeroing in on each of them. This is bigger than any of us, the woman said, her tone cold. You can walk away now, or you can face the fight. Your choice. For a moment, no one moved. Then slowly the suited man raised his hands, signaling his surrender. His men hesitated but followed suit, their weapons lowering one by one. Mark felt a surge of relief, but it was short-lived. The woman turned to him, her expression unreadable. This isn't over, she said quietly. Not for them, and not for you. What do you mean? Mark asked, his chest tightening. She glanced at Roberts, who was already stepping toward the drone, the briefcase still in hand. "You wanted the truth," she said. "Now you're part of it, and the truth has consequences." Before Mark could respond, the drone ascended rapidly, taking the briefcase with it. The woman turned and began walking away, Roberts following close behind. Mark stood there, frozen, as the headlights from the SUVs flicked off one by one, leaving him alone in the dark. The truth had consequences, she'd said. And Mark had a sinking feeling he was about to find out just how far they went.